Well, welcome to this Work with Purpose online session. We are so glad that you have joined with us today for this conversation about the significance and value of our work. And we want to highlight a few dynamics here as you think through this initial kind of overview of the chat feature. We're welcoming you to this conversation, and we want to hear from you as well. Down below, you'll notice there is an icon that shows a chat feature. That's where you'll be able to present and post some questions of our panelists in the coming portion of our time together. So just know that that feature is there, and you'll be able to share some of your thoughts and questions later in our time together. But we're so thankful for this time that we get to have with Sara Joy Proppe, who is the founder and director of Proximity Project, on this topic of aligning the park bench and the parish, how the church can serve the neighborhood through the built environment. So again, just note that chat feature. We'll be looking to hear from you as we move through our time together today. Well, we want to extend a special welcome to you on behalf of the Work with Purpose team. You'll note here this screen says your moderator will be Tessa Pinkstaff. And Tessa Pinkstaff is a colleague of mine here at Bethel. And she's not feeling real well today. She actually is here kind of working in the background still, but her voice is not terribly strong just due to some sickness that she has going on there. So you can be praying for Tessa to feel better soon, but we're thankful for her work in helping to set up this conversation with Sara Joy. Well, Work with Purpose is a part of our initiative here at Bethel Seminary and Bethel University to focus on the integration of faith and work. And that is not kind of limiting it to the type of work that we might typically think as sacred work or work of ministry. The reality is the kingdom of God doesn't have these stark divides between sacred and secular. All of our work is sacred when it is done unto the Lord. And so we're going to be exploring different dimensions of work, particularly with Sara Joy today, and thinking about how we understand space and place in light of a kingdom vision around us. And so Work with Purpose is designed to help facilitate conversations among pastors and marketplace leaders and others who care about this conversation of the intersection of faith, work, and economics. And so in order to help us in this particular space, we're going to invite Sara Joy to join us here with her video, and we're going to be able to hear from her today and some of the perspective that she brings in light of her work with Proximity Project. And Sara Joy, I'll just note that I see a mute on your microphone if you wanted to join in. We're so glad to have you with us today, and look forward to all that you will be sharing with us. And again, get your questions ready as we come to the end of this time with Sara Joy and her presenting. We'll be able to interact with her with some questions through that chat feature. Thanks, Sara. We were so grateful you could be with us here today.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to take a second, make sure I can control my screen here. There we go. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, all of you out there who have joined via webinar here. Good morning and good afternoon. I think we have a few time zones joining us. So just a little bit about me before we get things started. As noted, my name is Sara Joy Proppe, and I've been working on an initiative called Proximity Project. And really how that came about is I have worked for the past few years in urban planning and real estate development. And throughout my time professionally, I just really didn't find the church at the table a lot of times in these conversations about new real estate projects or community planning meetings, things like that. And it just really broke my heart because as I thought, as the church, we are about loving our neighbors, and the built environment has such an impact on how we can love our neighbors. So where's the church in this conversation? And also throughout that time, went on a walk a few years ago in my own neighborhood and saw probably about 20 churches within a single mile radius of my own home. And again, it just raised in me, here churches are such a significant landowner in the community. Where are they at this table? And as I kind of dug into that question more and more, I started to realize that a lot of it is simply because people just don't know and don't understand how the built environment affects them on a daily basis. And so from that point, I decided to do something about that. And so I've been working on Proximity Project really as a way to provide educational resources to churches to better understand their own property and how they can integrate it with the neighborhood and really seek human flourishing with their property. And then also providing consultation and advising on some creative ways that they can do that and really connect their mission with their physical church property. So it's been fun thus far, and I love being able to talk about these things. So thank you again for the opportunity to share about my passion for this. So today we're going to talk about the role of the church in serving the neighborhood through the built environment. And I really want to highlight that I'm kind of talking about the church in two ways here specifically. One, the church as a specific body of believers, a specific congregation that meets in a specific place, has maybe a house of worship, or maybe you're renting space from someone. And also the church as the general communion of saints. And the reason I want to talk about it in that context too is to really encourage people to take these ideas back to your own home. As you are a saint out in the world, bringing light to your own neighborhood and your own place where you live, these ideas can also take shape there. So they don't need to stop at the church property necessarily. So highlighting that so that you are encouraged to take these ideas beyond the church property. So first of all, I'd like to give some definition to some of these terms that get used. Let me see if I can advance here. There we go. So what is the built environment? I've started to understand that in my vocation, this is a very common term that gets thrown around, but not necessarily does everybody understand what this term means. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit for you all. We talk about the natural environment a lot, and I think we all have a very strong understanding of creation care and how the environment affects us. But I think we give less thought to the built environment, particularly because it's simply the space that we live in so many ways. And I always say, like fish swimming in water, we're kind of unaware of actually how much some of these things are impacting us. So I think that there's three definitions that I like to highlight for people to better understand this concept of the built environment. The first is the idea that it's actually a spatial and cultural product of human labor. So it's pretty straightforward, right? It's the things that we make, the spaces that we create. And then I like to expand upon it a bit and really put it in this context of it's us creating our setting for our own stories. And for me, that is such a privilege and an honor that God has given us to be co-creators in the setting of our stories. And so how do we shape those places to really speak to human flourishing, to really encourage that ministry of reconciliation that we are called to as Christians? And then lastly, it encompasses places and spaces that are created or modified by people. And I like to put this in terms of anything really that we modify. So often we think of it specifically in terms of buildings, but also it can take the shape of gardens and orchards, pathways, things like that. So really even the modification of the natural environment is a component of the built environment. And as Christians, we get to see it as really the stage for living out and participating in the gospel story. This is where we get to do it. This is where we get to figure it out. And I think that that's, again, just a very exciting opportunity. And how do we make use of that, that privilege and honor that we've been given? So really, again, thinking about it in terms of streets, sidewalks, parks, and gardens, it's really your neighborhood. Whether it be the neighborhood where you live or where you worship or where you work, all of those places. And it's really important too, I think we give a lot of attention to the idea of buildings as part of the built environment, but thinking about too the spaces between buildings. I think those are most often overlooked, and those are actually the spaces that really help develop the setting of our story. Those are where we have the pathways, the travel paths that we take to work, the roads that we drive on, the sidewalks that we walk on in our neighborhoods. Those are the places that really allow for us to encounter friends, to encounter the stranger. Those are the spaces that really open up room for dialogue. And so it's really important to consider those spaces between buildings. In fact, probably more than the buildings themselves in some ways. And so that's really where I'm going to spend a lot of my time, is talking about some of those spaces between buildings and how you can highlight them and use them for flourishing in your community. So I like to talk about too, why does it matter? Does the Bible actually have anything to say about physical spaces and places in our neighborhoods? And I would argue, yes, very, very much so. So taking those three terms that I just finished talking through, I'm going to talk kind of the biblical framework that I give for each of those. So first, it being a product. So in Genesis 1 here, we're given a command early on, right, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. And I think historically for me, being raised in the church, I was taught very much that filling the earth simply meant having babies and families and filling it with people. And I definitely believe that's a big part of that calling for sure. But at the same time, I think that that calling goes far beyond that. And there's a call there to fill the earth with culture, with order, with beauty, to really, again, bring creativity and add just liveliness and vibrancy to this earth. We've been given so many things to, in some ways, play with, right? To experiment, to figure out, and to bring order to the creation that we've been given. And so I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about the built environment. Next, the setting of our stories. So here we have in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve have just taken the tree of good and evil, and they are wandering in the garden, and God calls out to them, and he says, you know, where are you? And really at this time, God didn't need to know where they were. He knew where they were. But here he's calling Adam and Eve to orient themselves to a specific place, to one another, to him. He's really calling them to understand the setting of where they are. And I think that that's, again, an important thing biblically, that we are called to orient ourselves in a specific place. And then lastly, coming to that, the idea of space and place. Repeatedly throughout the Bible, you have the Israelites particularly coming and placing cairns or building altars in specific places where God has shown himself to be faithful. And here you have in Psalms, David is going to Jerusalem, and we have it built as a city to give thanks to the name of the Lord. And here David is going to a very specific place to give thanks, to recall how God has been good. And again, with the Israelites, as they wandered in the wilderness and placed these cairns and built these altars, these were specific places where they could tell the story of how God had been faithful to them. And it's really interesting, but for us as human beings, place is very important to memory for us. And we very much locate ourselves in a particular place as we remember specific stories and things that have happened in our lives. And so as Christians, I believe that it's really important for us to understand how specific places relate to our memory and our story of being able to share stories of God's faithfulness and goodness to future generations. And so I really believe that that is part of our biblical calling, to create places that make memories, that evoke memories, that allow us to really tell these stories to the coming generations. And in short, I really think that this is our calling to be place makers in the land of the living here. So in order to understand being a place maker, we kind of need to talk about, okay, well, what's the difference of space versus place? is there a difference? These terms often get used quite interchangeably, but I would argue that there are some nuances between each of these terms. And so we're going to talk that through a little bit because I think it's important to understand some of those nuances. So first, thinking of space. Space is usually global, or at least has very few limits, right? We think of space these days, lots of times we talk about it in terms of social media space or internet space, even thinking directly about outer space. So very few perceived limits, right? May not even have really any physical boundary. But in this space, right, there is room for creating. It might be kind of the empty page of a book, right? Room for interacting and creating that relationship and that story, but it's not there yet. In contrast with place, I would say that place is much smaller, right? It's very much more specific. It's going to have defined limits, and it's probably going to have a storied context. So something has happened or is happening here. And oftentimes there's shared meaning or collective memories that are happening around specific places. I like to frame this in terms of a baseball field. So if you look at a baseball field and you take away all the backstop, the bases, the bleachers, all of that, really what you have is a space, right? Just an empty field for anything to happen. But then as you add those boundaries, the baselines, the backstops, suddenly, and then you add people to the game, right? Suddenly it becomes much more of a place. And there's this cultural and shared understanding of the game and how things are played. So it becomes much more of a story in that way. And that's why you have things like really iconic places like Wrigley Field in Chicago, and just so much history and cultural meaning that is shared in that place. So that gives you kind of a sense of the differences between space and place. But as I mentioned previously, these are not mutually exclusive in any way. And they, in fact, seem to happen on kind of a spectrum. So I'm going to talk you all through that spectrum of place in a minute. So if you look here at your screen, there are 3 pictures that show up. And on the left side, we have a place, right? But I would argue that this is more on the side of space. If you looked at that picture, it would be pretty hard to locate yourself or to orient yourself in a specific place, right? Really, that picture could kind of be taken in anywhere in America. You wouldn't necessarily know where you are. And it's not completely void of being a place, though, because you have the McDonald's Golden Arches, which are very iconic American cultural meaning, right? But again, it's not an area or place that's super conducive to a lot of stories or some deep relationship building, I would argue. It's a place that's really meant for convenience, for quickness, things like that. But then you come to the middle picture here, and this is on a commercial corridor, and obviously you have some more local businesses. So there is definitely more of a personal investment in this area, but it's still on a commercial corridor. So there's probably still some drive-by traffic, and it may not be as shared of a neighborhood place, where there's deep memories being created there. But then you look at this picture on the right, and I'm not sure if you all can even tell from this picture, but this is actually a pizza shop that's located in the middle of a neighborhood. And it's in an old home, and they've turned it into a pizza shop, and they've got some tables seating outside there. And you really wouldn't even know that this place existed unless you lived in that neighborhood within a few blocks of that pizza shop. And this place is very much a place of collective memories, a place where, neighbors come together. I imagine it to be very much like Cheers, the place you go where everybody knows your name. And these are the places that really, develop and foster relationships and some of those deeper communications with people. And I'm sure that you all, I don't know if you all have ever experienced walking into a place like that where you're the outsider, but it's a can be a totally awkward thing too, right? You walk in and everybody turns and looks at you, and how to navigate being the outsider in these places. So hopefully that this gives you an idea of space versus place and the spectrum that it exists on, and they're not mutually exclusive. But again, I believe that we're called to be place makers. So how do we create those places that really do encourage relationship building and storytelling? And I would say too that in urban planning, there's been a movement over the past decade or so to really lament this idea of placelessness in American life. And thankfully, people are moving away from that. But there's really been a sense of building very generic places and not heeding kind of the local context. And what we're seeing now as a response to that is looking into how do we create places that are lively, that allow those stories to be developed, and work in favor of the biblical command to create memories and stories that we can tell of God's goodness. So coming back to the Bible with all of this, I like to go to Jeremiah 29 with the Israelites are living in exile in Babylon. And here I believe that God shows a very strong commandment to be placemakers, because the Israelites are living in a land that is not their own. And even though it is not their own, God calls them to really actively invest in the local community. And he tells them to build houses and live in them, to plant gardens and to eat their produce. And these verbs particularly are very physical, tangible verbs, really calling the Israelites to dwell in the land. So I think we need to challenge ourselves. What does it look like to dwell in the land, in our own neighborhoods, where we worship and where we live? And then God calls them, he says, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. And again, that seeking, I view that as a very important verb of going out into the public realm with a sense of purpose, with an idea of bringing shalom to the world around you. And I believe what's so important in seeking that shalom is to understand, what does the community need? What would provide for its welfare? And I think only when we can think of ourselves in relationship to a specific place and a specific community, only then can we begin to even know what to create or what to build, to produce, how we can seek the welfare of that specific place. And then God calls them to pray as well. So praying for that local community is definitely an important component. And I would like to read for you all here a quote. It's one of my favorites. It's a bit wordy, but I will try to take it slow so that you can capture it all. But Christopher Alexander, he's a very well-known urban designer who actually became a Christian through the study of architecture. So it's a very fascinating walk that he's had. And he says, in short, no pattern is an isolated entity. This is a fundamental view of the world. It says that when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must also repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And I think that's such a beautiful picture for us to really relish as Christians of what does it mean to be ministers of reconciliation and of redemption. What does it look like to build places that repair the world in that one place and that reverberate to the world around it? I think so often of, throwing a rock into the lake and the ripple effects. So how do we build places that have those ripple effects that then bring redemption and relationship to the world around us? And I really do believe that the things that we build can either contribute to the beauty and good of our communities, or they can add to the brokenness. And we have to think strategically about how we build places. So I'm going to challenge you with a quote here. Charles Montgomery, in his book Happy City, writes, "Every plaza, park, and architectural facade sends messages about who we are." So I always like to challenge churches. What message does your church property send to your community? Have you thought about that? Could you name that quickly? Believe it or not, the way your church property is designed and laid out can send a lot of messages to the local community. And we so often think very strategically about the interior of our properties and how the layout is designed and the welcome space and all of that within the interior of the building, but how often do we think much about the exterior of the property and what that is conveying to the world around us? So in light of that, I have two pictures up on your screen again here for you. The typical McDonald's picture, and then you have here on your left a picture of a community that is a walkable area that has some shops and some just lovely things going on, and just kind of walking you through the comparison of these two pictures. The picture on the right with the McDonald's, again, thinking about this in terms of what message does this convey to the world around it, you know, and I think even the maintenance, it shows that probably the human being is not all that valued. You've got the stop signs all askew, the plants need some trimming. There's not a really strong effort there being to make it a truly enjoyable, walkable experience for the community. And two, what's being conveyed here is kind of, again, that idea of convenience, of quick in and out. It's not a place necessarily that you're going to go and meander around and browse. Whereas the picture on the left here, things are done much more at what we call the human scale. And so that's at a scale that allows the pedestrian to really engage with the physical environment. So you see creative signage and some colorful artwork. You see street trees that allow for the pedestrian to feel much more safe because there's buffering between them and the road and the cars coming by. The way the buildings are situated with awnings and, again, signage that really, and open windows that really invites the passerby to engage with the community. So there's just really stark differences with the design of both of these places and what they convey to the human being and what is valued in these places, right? And unfortunately, we have gone the direction of designing many of our places to be like the places that look like the McDonald's. And that's where I encourage people to think, how do we design for dignity instead? What does that look like? And kind of the way that we've gone to is the places that are designed on the human scale are, you know, typically far more expensive to live in and to be a member of. And so how do we bring these places, this design for dignity, back to all places of our cities and places where we can really speak to that human dignity no matter the socioeconomic status and all of that. So we need to be thinking about that, I really believe. And two, really when we understand this design for dignity, I think that is part of our Christian calling because God created us as embodied creatures. He gave us physical senses, right? We can taste, see, smell, hear, touch. So it's no surprise that our physical world has actually incredible power to promote or detract from human flourishing. And really, as Christians too, we're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus on the ground, to really love our neighbors, to promote these ideas of human flourishing. And unfortunately, the way that we've built our cities over the past 50 years or so, we've really given priority to convenience and consumerism and the car. And I think we're seeing the effects of that in terms of just the rising problems with obesity, with isolation, segregation, loneliness. These are things that are really affecting our communities and our cities. And I would say too that our country is increasingly polarized, and we have lost so many of these spaces to practice civil discourse and civic virtue, and to learn how to share relationships and stories and communications with people who we don't always agree with. But so how do we as a church really step up to that and create some of those places to engage in that again, and to encourage the sharing of stories, encourage that relationship building. So I'm going to move into some ideas, some challenges for you with your own church property. And again, too, I would encourage you to think about how you can even do this with your own home and where you live as well. So the church yard. This is a church located in my neighborhood. And I always like to present this picture because for me, it is such a missed opportunity, I guess. I look at this and I think, oh, there's so much that you could do with that church yard. And I've never attended there, so I don't know, but I assume they're probably a welcoming church. And I know that they do have events from time to time. So they do have some neighborhood outreach that they're doing. But I feel like, oh, you're so missing out on this opportunity to convey to the world around you that there's life happening here. There's life going on inside this building. So what would it look like to add some ways to do that, to really bring the relationships of the church outside and likewise engage the local community to be there, right? So, and I also say too, I always point out with this picture of there's, it's a clean, well-kept property. There's nothing bad going on here. And so that's very positive. But at the same time, simply lack of having things well maintained doesn't necessarily convey welcome either. So that can, what's not happening on a property can almost send just as much of a message. So being mindful of that and keeping that in mind is important. So starting from there, I have some ideas about things that can be done to really help that interaction. So one thing that we talk about in urban planning in the built environment world is developing what are called thresholds. And thresholds are really important because they're this connection between the private and the public realm. And they really are a way to mitigate cocooning tendencies that we have to simply stay inside our own secure space and not interact with the world outside. And so there are ways that you can add these things to your property that really invite people into the property in a more real way. And so, for example, the top picture that you see here with the house, you have a front porch and a low fence there. And it's actually interesting, studies have shown that low fences like that can actually provide more community interaction because it's the homeowner or the business owner knows where their property line is, as does the person walking by. And so people don't have to navigate or play that dance of, is it okay for me to interact with you or not? Am I, crossing some boundary or am I not? Because there's a very clear boundary there. It frees people actually up to interact more because they understand where the boundary is and they don't have that concern. Then down below, we have the pizza shop again, and this is, again, outdoor seating, allowing people to interact and be out on the street, but also still be kind of a part of that interior life of what's happening there, eating pizza, being part of the restaurant activity. And then here on the right, we have a picture. This is a church building, and what they've done is they have a little seating nook area out by their door there, and they have a little community board that has different events and things going on. And again, here, this is just a way to invite people to participate in the community, but yet they don't have to go inside. They don't have to necessarily, bridge that divide at this point. They are free to sit there and be privy to what's going on inside the building. And then I have some pictures here of some churches that I think have done these things very well. So if you look here at picture number 1, this I think is really creative because what the church effectively has done is they've brought that physical boundary of the church out all the way to the sidewalk. And what that does is that really helps people passing by know kind of where the entrance to the church is and allows them to come onto the church property and engage with things without necessarily, again, going in that front door yet. So it allows kind of that gradual engagement with the property. And one thing that I really like that they did there is that there's 2 benches on either side. So it's a place of rest too. So if you're on a neighborhood walk and you want to stop and chat with your friend for a moment, you can take the stop at both of those benches and just enjoy a conversation. And so it's really life-giving to the local community too, offering a place of rest. Looking at picture number 2, I think what they've done well here is what I call the gradient of intimacy. This is a term coined by Christopher Alexander, the urban designer I referenced earlier. And what it's done here is set up kind of different levels of intimacy as you get closer to that front door. And so first you have these benches that really somebody could sit on. Again, they don't necessarily have to be attending there. They can be passing by, stop for a rest. And they're allowed to be there. And there's a sense of these are there for you. You're not encroaching on private property. And then you go from the benches up into kind of that circular area where there's a sit wall there. And that provides for a more intimate experience. So that, you might be more inclined to sit there with a friend, have a conversation, likely people coming in and out of service, spend time sitting around that area, talking with one another. And then from there, you walk into the front door. And I think that's a really important component to pay attention to with your property, as that step from the outside to the inside can be a very nerve-wracking step, particularly for people who have not attended church in a long time. And so if there are ways to create spaces for them to be before they actually enter that church door is, I think, really important thing to consider. And I know for me, somebody who has gone to church almost my whole life, even when I visit a new church, that step from the exterior to the interior can be one of the most daunting, because I don't quite know what I'm going to find on the other side of the door. So again, allowing people to kind of warm up to this space and giving them just the freedom to be on the property and to enjoy various aspects of rest or beauty. And so too, coming back to this idea of rest, in picture number 3, you have a low sit wall here along the edge of this church. And what this really does is, again, it provides a place of rest for people that are out on a walk in the community. And that's a very valuable thing, especially in communities where there's a lot of moms or young people with young children that are on walks that need a place to stop and rest, or elderly people who need a place to rest. So incorporating things like that is an important thing to think about. And what it also does here is the sit wall, again, provides kind of that boundary line between the church property and public space. And it really enables people to feel more free to engage in that area and to sit on that wall. So that's an important thing to think about. And then lastly, picture number 4. This church is doing a lot of good with their property. They've got a walking path that kind of breaks off of the main path there. And in this area, they've put a lot of gardens. They've added a bench. You can't see it very well, but it's tucked back in there. They have a little free library. And this is really just expressing invitation for people to come and be in this space and to enjoy the gardens that they have, to possibly read a book. They've thought it through very well, because they've put the park bench back where its back is protected, and you can see out into you have a larger vision of what's going on outside of you. And that's one thing that urban designers find, is that people love to sit where they can see what's happening around them and they can kind of interact with the world around them. So this church has just done a really creative job of finding ways to really invite people in to use their property and enjoy that. Moving on, the church parking lot. So I know this can be probably one of the most contentious spaces. Parking is always contentious, even as I do work in real estate development. And unfortunately, about 30% of the land in our cities is dedicated to parking. And really, this detracts from our tax base. This increases stormwater runoff, intensifies heat island effects. So parking lots are not the best for our local economy or our environment. So I always challenge churches, what are creative ways that you could open up your parking lot and utilize it as shared space? Are there other developments in your neighborhood that need parking that you could rent out parking during the week when you are not using it, and then possibly use some of that income then to do other improvements to your property and to area around you? I also encourage churches to think about holding festivals, or is there a weekly farmers market? I know that there's quite a few churches in my area that do that. So is there some type of path that you could find that way to include more activity with your parking lot? Another thing that I always think is really creative, here's a picture here of a parking lot that gets doubly used as a basketball court. So painting some lines for a basketball court or four-square court. Are there ways that you could do some creative work like that so that the neighborhood is welcome to use that space again when you're not actively using it? So I really challenge churches to think through some of that with their own space. And here's some also just some general guidelines that I have found helpful in this work of placemaking. Project for Public Spaces, they're a firm based out of New York, and they've really done a lot of research of what makes a great place. And they found that there's these four main elements of sociability, access and linkages, uses and activities, and comfort and image. And I really, again, just thinking about your own church property and putting it through this rubric of, you know, how are we conveying sociability? Do we have things, is our property interactive or welcoming? Are there ways that we're showing stewardship? The Project for Public Spaces always encourages people to have at least 10 things to do on a property. And I always say that seems kind of like a big stretch maybe initially. So start with 3, make that your goal. And really these things don't have to be big, intense things. It can be simple as having seating, having a bird feeder, and allowing people to watch birds, having wind chimes, and having that audio experience. So what does it mean to just provide some interactive elements for people to be outside together, to spend time in a space? Also, I always encourage churches to take what you're doing inside and bring it outside. So often there's so many great programs and things going on that happen only within the church walls. So what would it mean to bring those things out? I'm currently working with Colonial Church here in Edina, Minnesota, and one of the funny things that has been great to show them as I've worked with them is that they have some great native gardens on their property. And you walk in the front door to the church and they've got this great booth set up that says, you know, hey, this is what's growing in our gardens and all this great information. And I walked in, I said, this is awesome. Why is this inside? Why is this not outside where the gardens are, where people in the community can also see and participate? And it just never crossed their mind to put that stuff outside. So what are the things that your church is doing that are super creative, that really can be brought outside? Because there's a lot of resources that you all have that you can bring to the table. So thinking that through. And then access and linkages, thinking through, you know, what are the pathways around your property, and are they conducive to people getting there? Do they connect you with the neighborhood in good ways? Are there ways to improve upon them? Thinking also strategically about, you know, if you have, if you're in an area where people bike, you know, is there good ways to get there by bike? Do you have good bike parking? What about public transit? Do people know how to take the bus to your property if that's an option and a necessary thing? So thinking too, how are you integrated within the transit system? And then too, again, uses and activities kind of highlighted. If you're already doing something cool, bring it outside, invite people to participate. And then too, that comfort and image, making sure that what you are conveying is a sense of safetiness and cleanliness, and just really making things attractive and inviting people into your space. This is another thing, tips and tricks that have been developed for people thinking through their front yard. And so this is something you can take to your front yard, or also something that you can take to your front church yard. But again, having many things to do, as I've already highlighted, daylight and sunshine, that's super important too. So often people just place a park bench and think, oh, well, people will want to sit there, without thinking about where the park bench is located. Being in Minnesota, for me, Obviously, a park bench put in the shade is not going to get much use because it's freezing here half the time. So thinking strategically about where you're actively placing things is important. And then two, adding movable seating. So if you're going to put seating, really encourage you to think through making it movable, because then people can really shape and adapt it to fit their needs. So if they want to sit alone, they can move it and sit alone, or they can have a small group discussion, things like that. People always worry that the movable seating will walk off, but actually more often than not, it stays put. Very, very rarely do we have cases of vandalism. So just encourage you to think through having some movable seating. And then this active edges make active interiors. That's an important one I like to highlight, because it kind of goes back to the thresholds and the ideas that I was talking about, that if people don't feel comfortable at an edge of a space, they're not going to venture into the middle. So what are ways that you can create some active edges on your property and make them comfortable entering into that space? And then lastly, I always encourage people to start with asking questions. These questions in particular, I've found super fascinating. First Baptist Church in San Antonio is where my parents attend church. And I had a conversation with them not too long ago. And they said, you know, Sara Joy, we're really reorienting the way we're asking questions about our property. And they said, we're going to this idea of these nascent questions. And so these were the questions that they had been developing. And I was just so fascinated that they kind of flipped some of these ideas on their head, right? Instead of thinking, well, what construction does the city allow? It was, what kind of space does our city actually need? And instead of how much parking do we need? Well, how do we meet those needs, but yet not have an empty lot for the rest of the week? Who could benefit from the space? Or lastly, too, I think it was really fascinating of, instead of how do we create more space that we need, it's how well do we know people who have space in our community that we could possibly use? How do we know the venue? Well, do we know the venue schedulers or those shopkeepers? And can we create relationships there? So I thought that these were really great questions to start with. Additionally, you all probably have heard several times the 3 responses a community can have to a church when they leave the community. It's either good riddance, or, oh, there was a church here, or lastly, we're really sad that the church is gone. But again, this is a little bit reorientation of that question here that asks the church, you know, if you were magically lifted off the ground and moved, would you notice a difference? So again, that challenge of how well do you know your local community? How well do you understand ways to integrate there? And then too, thinking through, you know, what resources does our church have in these gifts of land and buildings that really could be leveraged to benefit the well-being of our congregation and of our neighborhood. So what can you do? I always like to bring it back to the individual person as well. And it's really simple. I would say walk and bike your neighborhood, grill in your front yard, host a block party, join the neighborhood council. I encouraged one pastor to play in the front yard with his kids, and he came back to me a couple weeks later and he said, this is crazy, Sara Joy. He's like, I've been doing this for a couple weeks, and he's like, I have talked to neighbors and met more people than I had in like years. And that seems to always be the story. So as simple as making yourself available in space to really interact and again, develop those places where you have those that communication, those relationships that get built there. And then too, I always tell people, know your council member. I think it would be a game changer if, as churches, we came into the door of council members and said, you know, hey, what can we do to help you make this community better? Because council members and elected representatives are getting so much being asked of them. And so I think very rarely do they have people showing up saying, hey, how can we help you? I think that could be a real game changer for the church to do that. So those are some ideas. Here's some recommended resources. These are people, books, websites, films that have guided my own thinking in this area over the past few years. And so I encourage you to check some of them out. They're great, great resources to look through and help you better understand the built environment and our role as Christians in that. And then lastly, this is just a little bit about Proximity Project. We provide educational workshops and resources. So small group stuff, doing Sunday school, adult education hours, that's things we love to do, and providing consulting services, helping you really assess your property and look for opportunities to make it more engaging with the neighborhood, and ways that you can do that. So thanks for listening to me today. I hope this has been helpful, and I think we maybe have some questions at this point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sara Joy. This has been rich and meaningful, and such a joy to be able to learn from you and your expertise in this area. We do have a number of questions that have come in. I'll just say that we probably have about 5 minutes, so not a lot of time to be able to engage on these comments and questions. But I'll throw out a couple. Betsy asked a couple, or at least noted a couple things. One was just a general comment about, in some ways, this conversation represents a privilege that we have when we have resources to be able to think about place and space and property and these kinds of dynamics. And so, and just really an observation saying, that means we need to be intentional with what we have. And I think that's probably true with folks across the socioeconomic perspective. What do you have, and how do you steward that with intentionality? And then Betsy also asked, can you talk a little bit more about spent time in a third place?
Oh, sure.
Maybe
I'm glad you asked.
That theme a bit.
Yeah. So third place is a term that was developed by sociologists probably like 10 years ago now or so. And it's this idea that most of us have our home, our work, and then we have a third place. And it might be, the local library or the local coffee shop or the neighborhood bar, a place like that that we go to pretty consistently, where we develop some of those relationships. And so I always encourage people to identify what's a third place in your community that you would like to develop relationships in, and go to that place and frequent it and work on developing that relationship and being a regular there.
Yeah. Christy asks a question about their own church. They have recently made a shift to using a single door entrance at their church for security reasons, and wondered if you'd comment a little bit on kind of that tension between some security considerations as well as wanting to communicate openness and welcoming spirit. Thoughts that you'd have for Christy's and others who are engaging that.
Yep. So one thing that we always say is that good behavior drives out bad behavior. And so again, really understanding what are the good things that are happening and how do you take those things and make them more visible, and really make them more vibrant and more part of what people are seeing with the space. And I think that a lot of times ends up, driving out and curbing a lot of the insecurities and the bad things that can be happening, because again, as people see that there's community and life happening there, it starts to change the dynamic. So that's always one way I say to start is, how do you bring out the positive things and really make those particular entrances, how do you make them even more dynamic? So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Sara Joy. And then our friends at Made to Flourish kind of noted that they were expressing that some pastors might feel a little overwhelmed by this conversation, particularly if they are in kind of well-established buildings that don't have a lot of extra space to work with on their property. And they asked for you to just comment a little bit on, to folks that are in those situations where there's not a lot of extra space to repurpose, just thoughts for those who are, not in a colonial church kind of environment, but older churches that maybe don't have as much space to work with. Speak to those pastors and ministries. Right.
I think what's fun is that actually the smaller the space, the more constrained you are and the more creative you can get. So I would say that even these churches that are, smaller spaces, maybe more landlocked, there are likely little areas where you can put out seating. There are creative ways to do signage, things like that. So I still think that there's a lot of creative things that you can do. And what's interesting too, even a church like Colonial, even though their property is fairly large, they are effectively in an area that's mostly a swampland. So there's actually not a whole lot of space for them to actively do building new things, right? But again, highlighting what is there and how do you make it more visible to the local community. So I think that there's a lot, even, putting in some fun bike racks that are more artistic and creative, just things that really show, oh, they thought about this. And, there's a funness here, a uniqueness, a life vitality here that they're conveying through even creative things like that. I think there's a lot you can do.
Well, so appreciate just the practical recommendations that you gave, not only to those leading institutions or congregations, but helping us think about our own space in the places that we live, the playing in the front yard, creating welcoming and opening connections with how we do low fences versus high fences, these kinds of things. So many really good takeaways that you've given us as individuals as we think about our own space and place as well. Wonder if you just have any final word of encouragement before we close out with some final announcements and comments.
Yeah. So a couple of things I'd like to say, because I know I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A. So if people have questions, feel free to email me. I'm totally willing to engage via email with questions people have. And also I would say, I feel like our time is so ripe for the church to really step in and to truly love people and show the reconciliation of Jesus through the built environment. It's it's a place that I think we can really show a lot of tangible, hope of redemption. And so I think that is really encourage people to think about that in ways that you can be creative with your property and get to know your neighbors, because we need that so desperately right now. And so I really encourage church leadership to take a strong stand in that and to move forward in that.
I clicked back to this page prior to the question page just to highlight again Sarah's contact information for those of you that would like to reach out to Sara Joy and the services of Proximity Project. We encourage you to do so. You can email her at sarajoy@proximityprojectinc.com.
Yeah.
And just so thankful for the good work that you're doing, Sara Joy. Thanks for encouraging us with that today. It's some of the things that we are trying to highlight in our work with the Work with Purpose team. And there's just lots of partners who care about these types of conversations here in the Twin Cities and beyond. And one of those communities that was already mentioned through the Q&A is the partners that we have in the Made to Flourish network. And the Made to Flourish network here in the Twin Cities is offering a learning community in 2019 for churches that really want to do a deep dive in having conversations about the intersection of faith, work, and economics in the ministry of their church and their communities. And so there will be a series of 3 gatherings that's taking place in the learning community in March, May, and August of 2019. With great people like Christopher Brooks that Work with Purpose team brought in this last year, and just as Jim, hearing from voices like these individuals, helping church leaders and ministry partners in the church, bringing together marketplace leaders and ministry leaders from a local church context to have a conversation throughout a year over these 3 times of gathering. And for churches that are willing to invest in this process as a church, they can bring along multiple leaders into these learning community conversations. And we just really want to give a strong word of affirmation to what our Made to Flourish partners are doing here in the Twin Cities. So reach out to them. There is more information available at madetoflourish.org, learning-communities/Twin Cities. And of course, you can reach out to us here at Work with Purpose if you also need a reminder of how to get a hold of these friends. We have a lot of resources available to you, things like this online learning session that we have gained insight and perspective from with Sara Joy. We have an archive of these types of resources, interacting with great voices in this conversation from people like Amy Sherman, Tom Nelson, Andy Crouch, Stephen Garbers, and Ken Blanchard. And so reach out to us if you would like to hear any of these archived resources. You can go to Work with Purpose's websites and just Google Bethel, Seminary, and Work with Purpose, and you should be able to navigate towards these resources. We encourage you to sign up for our email list as well and look for a calendar of events on our website at Work with Purpose. And again, we just want to say thank you for joining us. We're so glad that you took some time to be with us today. Especially, we want to give thanks to Sara Joy and her sharing this wisdom.